talking about how when the Armenians were brought back to Marash, there were Turks living in their homes and their businesses had been destroyed. And so the Armenians were really having to, I'll use an Americanism here, had to start from scratch, that they didn't have a lot. And that this put them at this terrible disadvantage in an effort to rebuild. American missionaries had come to the Ottoman Empire, initially with the hope of trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. The Ottoman state and the Armenians were on a collision course, especially in eastern Anatolia. I mean, I think to most sensitive observers, it appeared to them that the relationship between Kurds, Turks, and Armenians in eastern Anatolia in that period was really untenable.
Hello everyone. Today in my podcast Unfiltered History we had Kid Devid Uothenpo, who is professor of human rights studies at University of California, Davis, and he is author of fantastic book Bread from Stones, and this is history of American humanitarianism. And today we talked about Near East Relief, very important organization that provided billions, literally billions of dollars to help to relieve survivors of Armenian genocide, particularly orphans, that opened orphanages in Armenia, that provided education for these children. And we discussed all this story in details, who, when, how did this job, and also tried to understand more general questions, why they did it, what were motivations, was it civilized mission, or it was just poor humanitarianism. And also I think that this conversation will give you also some knowledge about justice, memory, and how we choose to respond to suffering far from here and far from our nation. Please watch this video, like this video, and continue watching our podcast. Thank you. Kit, hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay, thank you, and I'm very happy that you're in Armenia, and it's a great opportunity to speak about the topic you work on professionally, and which is also a great personal interest of me, because since my grandparents were survivors of the Armenian genocide, and they grew up in American orphanages.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes,
yeah.
in Alexandropol, in Gyumri.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why this topic is kind of part of my family story, not only just the story I am interested in. And I think we can let's start from the beginning. For listeners who may not be familiar, what exactly was the Near East Relief?
Sure, Sir. Thank you so much for having me. This is really a pleasure to be here. And it's always, I always enjoy talking about this history, in part because it's a history that brings together, I think, the best of America with Armenians. It's a history that, of course, there's what reasons to criticize the organization Near East Relief, but in general, I think, or on balance, many contemporary Armenians have a history with that organization, and I think that what the organization helped shape what is today modern Armenia and the Armenian diaspora. So let's just back up a little bit. So I'm a professor of human rights studies at UC Davis, and I wrote my second book on American, what I called modern humanitarianism, but focusing primarily on the American international humanitarian response to the 1915-1922 effort to exterminate the Armenians as a people in Anatolia. And Near East Relief was the institution at the very center of that effort. It was, in today's parlance, a non-governmental organization, even though it was sponsored, or it had been chartered by the U.S. Congress, meaning it just received not monetary support, but sort of political support. Near East Relief was the brainchild of some of America's progressive era's leading thinkers, and it was dedicated to initially the support of Lebanese and Armenians facing famine during the Great Syrian Famine of 1914 to 1915, and then later on took on this enormous task of providing first relief assistance to Armenians, and then what we would now call today development and rehabilitation assistance to Armenians.
Yes, and what is a spontaneous act of generosity or something more organized strategically?
Sure, I think it has its origins really in the American response to the Hamidian massacres of the 1880s. So the United States had a long-term Protestant missionary presence in what we would call the Americans call the Near East, right? So what we're really talking about here is the Middle East, even though there was also a fairly strong Protestant missionary presence around Lake Urmia to the Assyrians and so on. Very little missionary work in the Caucasus, American missionary work in the Caucasus. And so American missionaries had come to the Ottoman Empire, initially with the hope of trying to convert Muslims to Christianity, and that just wasn't working. And then they focused their attention on what they unfortunately refer to as primitive Christians, which were Armenians and Syriac and Assyrian Christians who either who had their own liturgy in the case of the Armenians, or in the case of the Assyrians, or were part of sort of a Greek Orthodox Christianity in the region. But they quickly turned from just being conversion oriented to developing schools and colleges even. This is the origin of Robert College in Istanbul and the Syrian Protestant College in Beirut that eventually becomes the American University. And
American College.
The American College there and the American College in Merziphone. And these were sort of not exactly colleges in the modern sense. They were sort of between a high school and a college. They also established hospitals, and they, along with the German Hilfsbund, had developed, and also the Ottomans as well, had developed modern hospitals throughout the region. And this created a meaningful relationship between Armenians in particular and Americans, so that when the massacres took place in the 1880s, a great deal of interest arose. And Americans became used to the idea that Armenians were at risk in the Ottoman Empire, and that America had a special responsibility to help.
So Armenian massacres were this particular moment, then they broke through and just it sparked the large-scale movement?
Well, it wasn't a large-scale movement at that point, but what really sparked the large-scale movement was with the outbreak of the Second World War, First World War. Okay. First World War, still early for me. The First World War. Americans began to learn first about efforts about the Great Syrian Famine in Palestine and in what is today Palestine and what is today Lebanon, which was caused by a series of terrible locusts. Locusts, of course, are like giant grasshoppers, and when they swarm over an area, they can eat everything in just a few minutes. But also, like all famines, this was an artificial famine that was created by the Ottoman Empire, and then also by a blockade of the port of Beirut by Allied forces. And so this really raised American interest in supporting. But then what really sparked American interest were the beginning of the deportations in April of 1915, as Americans, including the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire at the time, Ambassador Morgenthau, began to communicate back to the United States reports that were published widely. And this motivated a group of progressive era leaders, intellectuals, businessmen, and others to establish first the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, which then evolved into Near East Relief. And it very quickly became the largest non-governmental relief organization in American history to that point. And it was focused almost exclusively at the beginning about sending food and foodstuffs to the region that would be distributed by local missionaries and the faculty at the American University and elsewhere. And that changes after the end of the First World War and the Allied occupation of the region.
And I also recalled that American humanitarian mission started with Clara Barton. Am I correct?
Clara Barton visited the Ottoman Empire during the Hamidian massacres. She'd been in the American Red Cross, which is distinct from the International Committee for the Red Cross, Red Crescent. She was prompted by the Hamidian massacres to visit, and her book is actually a really wonderful first-hand account of the region. It's also important that she and other observers really, I think at the time, really understood that the Ottoman state and the Armenians were on a collision course, especially in Eastern Anatolia. I mean, I think to most sensitive observers, it appeared to them that the relationship between Kurds, Turks, and Armenians in Eastern Anatolia in that period was really untenable, and that something was going to give. So Barton was at the beginning, but then it was Morgenthau whose reports back home really spurred American interest, and the interest of some very wealthy Americans.
It was my next question. I wanted just to know who were the people driving Near East Relief forward. Were maybe the governmental circle or just churches, I don't know, or regular citizens?
A lot of regular, well, it was very wealthy citizens, Cleveland Dodge and others who had the ear of President Wilson at the time. They were really, I think they were moved. They also saw as an opportunity. We should talk about the opportunity that they saw later on. But then what was always interesting to me about the origins of Near East Relief, and you can see this in the beautiful posters, the propaganda posters that were produced. I'm sure you've seen them. They have titles like "Lest We Perish," and you could see an image of like a beautiful but vulnerable Armenian girl amongst ruins. There also were posters with images of sort of a beautiful representation of America as a female form with a sword taking care of a waifish child. And the idea is that America was going to come to the rescue of the Armenians. And it was very much a kind of a white man's burden idea, that Armenians were in need of rescue. And indeed, Armenians were certainly in need of support in this area, because they weren't getting it from the Ottoman state, the state of which they were citizens, because the Ottomans were trying to exterminate them. Those posters were part of a much larger effort to raise interest amongst the American people about what was happening to the Armenians. Not just to raise awareness and build support, but also to elicit donations. So Near East Relief was distinct from the American Relief Association, which had been established by the federal government in the wake of the First World War and led by eventually President Herbert Hoover to help in Russia. Near East Relief didn't get that kind of support, and instead it was dependent upon small donors, people collecting money at their churches or their local Rotary clubs, or Boy Scouts going out and recycling and then paying, putting the money into these efforts to raise money for Near East Relief.
In the only school, right? Some children just gave their breakfast.
That's right. They would skip lunch or breakfast, and their breakfast money would go to Near East Relief. And of course, the most famous of all their great propaganda projects or consciousness-raising projects was the use of an Armenian genocide survivor, Aurora Mardigian. They've changed her name from Arsha Louise Mardiganian, to help with. They made an extraordinary film, very problematic film that they would show to help raise money. And but most recently there was a wonderful film that was produced here in Armenia about that called Aurora's Aurora sunrise. So Near East relief was really dependent.
So
go ahead.
Sorry, just again to stress it
Sure.
for our listeners that the film The Ravaged Armenia, that is so well known now in Armenia and internationally, it was created because they wanted to raise funds.
That's right. It was
the first reason, the first aim, the first goal was not just related to art. But it's for help,
and that was the context for the film. It wasn't really shown out of it wasn't shown in regular cinema for regular release. Instead, there would be events would be held in civic auditoria or at churches where they would show the film. There would be speakers, and then they would raise money, and that with the other fundraising campaigns were very successful. Because after the end of the First World War, Near East relief transformed from just providing food relief and support to taking on this burden of caring for Armenian orphans, many of whom were technically half orphans, meaning that their mothers were still alive. But Near East relief would often put pressure on them to bring their children to the orphanage because they believed they couldn't take care of them. And then Near East relief also became part of the larger process after the end of the First World War to try to repatriate Armenians back into Anatolia and to put them, I mean, they weren't necessarily from these places, but to return refugees to Marash and Aintab and other parts of Cilicia. And so this was a very expensive process. Near East relief had to establish feeding centers, schools, orphanages, small business loans, and so on. Because when the Armenians returned to these places, everything that they had been stolen and taken from them. And so you hear these descriptions from people like Stanley Kerr, who is a major humanitarian figure in this period, talking about how when the Armenians were brought back to Marash, there were Turks living in their homes and their businesses had been destroyed. And so the Armenians were really having to, I'll use an Americanism here, had to start from scratch, that they didn't have a lot. And that this put them at this terrible disadvantage in an effort to rebuild. But Near East relief was very successful, at least in raising money for this early period, up until about 1921, 1922. But then, of course, a resurgent nationalist Turkey and the so-called Turkish War for Independence happened. The French would draw from Cilicia, and the Armenians who were resettled in Cilicia had to flee back to Syria and to Lebanon, where again, Near East relief took on a major burden in trying to help them integrate within Syrian and Lebanese society.
Yeah, and another question I wanted to discuss. Armenians were on the focus of this acts, or maybe all these efforts, they also, Armenians were framed or presented to the public in a unique way, or it was just part of the bigger humanitarian mission concerning to Christians and Greeks and Assyrians or others, or Armenians were in the center of this?
That's a very good and interesting question.
Yeah.
So what I argue in my work, and I think the evidence shows this, is that Near East relief really understood Armenians as a unique humanitarian problem. So of course a lot of Near East relief support went to Greeks and to other Christian communities. But you have to think about this for a moment after the end of the First World War. And this is a little bit, when this is where we have to, in our thinking, separate the way that Near East relief thought about Armenians in the Middle East as opposed to Armenians in the Caucasus in the era of the Republic of Armenia and then the Armenian Soviet. Is that the Greek refugees had a country, Greece. Other, right? Arab Christian refugees or other refugees had Syria and Lebanon. But at the end of the First World War and the failure of the project to create in Cilicia and Galicia, to the failure to create there an Armenian national home and the failure to create a Wilsonian Armenia, all of this meant that Armenians, even though Turkey was supposed to allow them to return in a haunting sort of reminiscence of the current situation for the people of Artsakh, that even though Turkey was supposed to allow Armenians to return, if they did return, they faced murder and the destruction of their property. So Armenians didn't have a state to protect them. And there's no real substitute for a state in terms of protecting your basic civil rights or your right to exist. And so Near East Relief imagined its relationship with the Armenians in a much different way, one in which they, the organization, had to provide to the Armenians and support the Armenians in a way that a state might. And this is why they saw Armenians as being different. And just as a side note, there's an interesting Turkish denialist trope that goes along with that decision, which is that Turkish denialists of the Armenian genocide would love to say, the Americans, they only helped the Armenians. They didn't help the Turks. Well, what did Turkish refugees have? They also had a state.
Yeah.
So that makes the situation very different.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Right? And so what did that actually mean? So the League of Nations would help take over many of these elements later on, especially with the Nansen passport regime and so on. But Near East Relief did something very interesting that distinguished them from earlier missionary efforts. If you recall, I talked about how the reason, at least the original reason for the American missionaries going to the Armenians was to convert them to Protestant Christianity, right? Near East Relief didn't do that. They said, when orphans would come, when others would come to work with them, their rule was that if an orphan came and they were apostolic, they weren't going to convert them. If the orphan came and they were Catholic, they weren't going to convert them. If they came and they were Protestant, they weren't going to convert them. And that they worked extensively with the Armenian Apostolic Church in exile there at Antilias to really emphasize Armenian language instruction, the teaching of Armenian history and culture, and finally, and this is often understudied, the education of girls, which really distinguished them from even from the Arabs or the Turks in that era, which is that girl attendance in Near East Relief schools was almost the same as boy attendance in Near East Relief schools. And this is also just the fact that so many more girls and young women survived the genocide.
Yes, even more. Just coming back to this issue of language, in some regions, even Armenians were Turkish speaking before coming of American missionaries, and Armenian missionaries even just made them to turn into Armenian language. It's fantastic.
Right. I think this is a really important element of what Near East Relief did, is that you could imagine them saying, okay, all these Armenians are now in Syria and Lebanon. They've got to learn Arabic. Yes. Otherwise they're just, and what is the traditional sort of history of refugees, right? Especially refugees who they just kind of
to be integrated
and they kind of disappear.
Hosting societies,
right? What the Americans understood and what was very important to them, and I think this is an under what's supposed to say this? This is not a well understood element of their contribution to broader Armenian history, which is that they understood that if they didn't help reestablish and collaborate with important Armenian intellectuals and educators and others, especially those in Beirut and in Aleppo, that process would be repeated, that Armenians would just sort of disappear into Syria or into Lebanon. And that was unacceptable to them. Yeah. Because I think they had this sense, and this is important too, Sուրեն, is that they believed that what had happened to the Armenians was wrong. And that they had this sense of what they wouldn't call it that then, but what we might call today restorative justice. They thought that part of their role was to help the Armenians achieve justice through the restoration of community. Now, what's interesting, and this is what you point out, of course, and this is perhaps a topic for another day, is that many Armenians who fled into Syria and Lebanon and to here, they spoke Armenian, they spoke dialects of Armenian that are unintelligible to other Armenians. Yeah. They spoke Turkish, they spoke Greek, they spoke Arabic, they spoke Kurdish, right? Language wasn't the marker of national identity that it is today. You just had a language because you needed a language, right? And Near East Relief and other groups saying, well, what could help bind the Armenians together? Oh, we can use this language that was developed for the Armenian press in Western Armenia as the language that can bind them together. And what was always remarkable, I have to tell just a story. So I lived for a couple of years in Aleppo in the 1990s, right? And before the terrible civil war in Syria, Aleppo was a viable, functioning, vibrant, cosmopolitan, but also Western Armenian-speaking community, where people could do everything in their lives, live full lives using Western Armenian as their first language. They could go to school, they could go to church, they could read the newspaper, they could listen to the radio, they could go enjoy arts and literature, they go to the doctor, right? They could do everything they needed to do. And of course, everyone knew Arabic because that's how you interact with the government. And I tell you, it was remarkable to me how incredibly, how this had created such a sense of solidarity and feelings of joy and identity amongst the Armenians of Aleppo. And indeed, the main Armenian neighborhoods are the old Near East Relief camps that were established, right? Yeah. And they're, even the way that they're laid out, the way that the rectilinear plan of those neighborhoods laid out are where the tents were set up, and eventually they became houses.
This Western Armenian speaking, this network of schools and this active community, Armenian speaking community, was kind of legacy of Near East Relief efforts.
In part, and I think it demonstrates, I think, a very important lesson about humanitarianism, which is that if humanitarianism, surely many Americans involved in Near East Relief, they saw the Armenians as a way to help bring modernity and change and so on to the region. But in terms of actual practice, they were committed to collaborating extensively with established Armenian institutions, including the church and the intellectuals who had survived and fled into exile, right? And so one of the things that I work on is the memoir of Karnik Panyan, or Garnik Banyan. So Karnik Panyan was a young Armenian from Gurin in Anatolia. Family was deported. He was first put into a German orphanage by his grandparents and then eventually transferred to the infamous orphanage at Antura near Beirut, where the Ottoman state tried to turn him into a Turk. So that's only part of the story, because at the end of the First World War, American Near East Relief takes over that orphanage. And you can see there's this incredible difference, right? And again, sort of Turkish denialists will often say, well, what's the difference between the Turks and the Americans? They're always trying to turn they both were trying to turn the orphans into something that they weren't. Well, the main difference is the Americans hadn't murdered Karnik's parents. The Ottoman state had murdered Karnik's parents. And the Americans were working to help them rebuild lives as Armenians. And so the orphans, though, were going to be part of this project of bringing Armenians and putting them back.
Yeah,
I mean, I would say back. I mean, back isn't really the right word, because you're taking all these young people who are from all over Anatolia, and you've decided that back is Aintab.
Aintab, yeah, Cilicia.
Right, and whereas many Armenians were from Cilicia, but many more that were being sent to Cilicia were not.
And difference is just visible again for my listeners. In Turkish orphanage of Antura, speaking Armenian was prohibited, and even not prohibited, but punishable
by terrible beatings.
Yeah, by terrible beatings. They were prohibited to pray Christian prayers. I don't know,
or sing songs or anything like that.
Yeah, it just was how to say, to place for social engineering, and they tried to turn Armenians into citizens of
new Turkish citizens.
Turkish citizens, yeah.
Right. And the Nearest Relief, by contrast, said, no, these are Armenian children, and if the Armenians are going to rebuild themselves as a people, these are the people who are going to do it, these young people.
Yeah, another question is about, you mentioned something, but I wanted just to focus on this. There is this idea that humanitarian aid sometimes carries a kind of civilizing mission, and with it, and especially when it comes from the West. And do you think Nearest Relief saw itself as purely helping, or it was just also have a deeper goal to remark or uplift these Armenian children to a central image of more civilized, or I don't know.
I would argue that Nearest Relief had a civilizing mission. It was a very American civilizing mission. I don't think there was any ambition. Oftentimes humanitarianism is accompanied by colonialism, right? So French humanitarianism in Africa, British humanitarianism in Africa,
in India,
this was accompanied by colonialism. With this, I think the false start of an American mandate for Armenia as an exception, which never would have, even if the U.S. Senate approved it, it never would have happened, because the United States was never going to send military troops to Anatolia to defend against the Kemalists or the Soviets. So this was humanitarianism without empire building, right? There was no colonialism that accompanied it. So instead, it was this it was part of this larger American idea about how education, social science, capitalism could uplift a people. And so Nearest Relief was really a manifestation of early 20th century American progressive ideology, right? And I think a lot of it was paternalistic, but education is paternalistic. It viewed Armenians as children in wards. Armenian orphans were in need of support that the community at that point was not capable of providing. And the other thing, of course, is that Nearest Relief ended. It ended, right? So it ended for a couple reasons. There were some efforts to try to maintain a presence, but for example, as the orphans became young adults and became self-sufficient, which was the goal of their policies, like Karnik Panian, even though he became a beloved educator at the Gemaran in Beirut, he was trained to be an electrician. So I think all of us intellectuals, you and I, we should always have a second job, like electrician, car mechanic, just in case that academic thing doesn't work out. And so Panian and others, when they aged out, is the idea. Nearest Relief didn't really have much more to do, and so it began to draw down the organization.
The mission accomplished.
In a way, but also, since they were largely a small donor-driven organization, it was very difficult for them to raise money to help young adults, people who should be self-sufficient. And so, for example, the large complex that had been built for the orphans and his educational and training facility Antilias was turned over to the Armenian Church, and it's where the Patriarchate is now. And so Near East Relief as an organization eventually transitioned to become the Near East Foundation, which still exists. It's a much smaller organization that primarily works in Africa, but also had worked in other parts of the Middle East, almost exclusively in terms of technical and agricultural training, and now does a lot of work supporting women's entrepreneurialism and small business formation, even though it has this real heritage of working in the region of the Middle East. Now, of course, this is not an area I know as well as I know the Middle East, but of course, Near East Relief operated here in Armenia much longer than it did in the Middle East, and is the only American organization that persisted long into the era of the Soviet Republic, working primarily to assist orphans and orphan relief that supported your grandparents. In Gyumri. Right? It was called Orphan City, which was an enormous
15,000.
I know, an enormous orphanage facility. And you just imagine the 15 to 20,000 young people were there. How many contemporary Armenians have like a grandparent or great grandparent who had been there, right? That legacy is really saturated throughout contemporary Armenian society. And of course there.
Yes, looking at these pictures portraying these crowds of orphans staying near the orphanages, I try to think where my grandparents are. Maybe they are just exactly that people, children I see in the moment.
I think you could try. I know I told this story earlier at the conference about how we found the photo, how we identified Karnik Panyan in one of the school pictures from the orphanage. So it's really possible, I think.
Maybe, and with the help of artificial intelligence.
AI is maybe right. I think there should be a way to use some kind of AI to help identify. But these photographs are good, but they're very grainy, and unfortunately they had the habit of shaving everyone's head to keep down the spread.
They look similar.
They all look so similar. And they dress them all in these sort of rough garments and so on. So it could be tough to
and because one of my duties as a host of this podcast just make some contradiction in our in our conversation. I want also to ask if everything in Near East Relief got right in this work, or there were do you see tensions, contradictions, or even failures in how approached its mission, the people it aimed to help?
I think one of the most problematic things they did, and you can see this in the first is how they really exploited the stories of the orphans. This idea of kind of a salacious a pornography of pain, it's sometimes called. And this was the way they treated Aurora Archelouise, was appalling, the way that she was exploited. In part because they saw it as justified to tell these kinds of stories that infantilized Armenians, robbed them of their agency, created them as helpless, none of which was true, as a way to tug at the heartstrings of American donors. And that was a problem, not only because it created Armenians as a kind of helpless, which was not true. It then also led to some very bad choices that they made down the road, which was, do you remember I talked about this phenomenon of the half orphan? So in my opinion, a half orphan is not an orphan, right? There's no such thing as a half orphan. right? This was the language that they used. And so what they did was that they prioritized, if a mother had a child or children, Near East relief officials would try to take that child and put the child in the orphanage. And that was devastating, right? Almost all the children, with the exception of Karnik that I write about in my book, their mothers still were in the picture, but Near East relief took them away. And just to give you a sense of how modern relief and humanitarian and social work addresses that situation.
Yes, and yes, to build more empathy and get people, I don't know, across the country to open their wallets.
They did that, but they didn't trust the mothers.
Oh.
And so in what we would do, the better approach, the better practice, is saying, oh, let's help the mothers take care of their own children.
Interesting,
right?
Yeah.
And so they didn't trust the mothers to do that. And plus, they wanted to bring orphans into the orphanage so that they could say, "Look at all these orphans we're helping." It's more, but I mean, the stories that you think about this, you think how awful this must have been for the mothers, because they probably felt like they had no choice, that they had to turn their children over, and it simply would have been a question of providing them with modest assistance, a job, childcare, education, the things that would allow them to do it. And it's just like today, in terms of orphan care, the priority is, and this is true even in Armenia, is putting children into foster care where they can live with families or helping support their mothers rather than warehousing them in orphanages.
Yeah. So and I'm not sure if you just encountered this case in your research. In Armenia, we have or had these stories about Armenian children who were taken to the United States, or they said the most beautiful of them, the cleverest of them, were taken to the United States.
So a lot of that didn't happen a lot. There were small resettlement plans. Near East Relief still really they didn't operate to outsource children. But there were efforts, especially if a child had a relative in the United States. So this was not that your listeners understand this is not a modern phenomenon that every Armenian family has someone in Poland or France or the United States or Uruguay, right? That really is a phenomenon that began in the 1880s. So many children had relatives who lived overseas. What was more often the case is that especially women who had been taken by Turkish or the Turks or the Kurds during the genocide, had been sort of forcibly married and then brought back into these rescue homes. Near East Relief operated some, the League of Nations operated others, often were sent to the United States and other places as what we call mail order brides. That Armenian men in the United States would send inquiries to here, to Yerevan or to Aleppo or to Beirut and say, I'm interested in a wife. And the ethics of that doesn't seem quite right to us today.
Yeah, but we cannot just judge this from the perspective of today's perception.
Right. And I think that there's stories, of course, of where this works and stories where it doesn't work. We also know plenty of love matches that don't work. But this was viewed at the time as an efficient and effective way to take Armenian women who would be a burden otherwise and send them to a place in the United States where they could become members of households and work. And this is, I live in California, where there are Armenians who can, we have the largest population of Armenians outside of here in California, and many of whom can trace their origins to at least one woman who was transferred to the United States in such a fashion, and became, a beloved Metzmama. And it's part of it. But I always want to make the distinction between that and sort of, there's sort of this other sort of dual patriarchal problem here, right? On the one hand, many of these women had been stolen, abused, raped, denied choice by their Turkish or Kurdish captors, only then to be sort of facing a similar kind of transfer where they maybe had some choice but not a lot of choice because their economic choice was not there.
Yeah.
On the other hand, in the United States or other places where this took place, they could become part of the Armenian church. They could join Armenian clubs. There'd be other Armenian women with whom they could do it. So ultimately, this is why we have to prevent genocide, because it forces people into these terrible no-win choices.
Yeah, and of course another aspect of Near East Relief is very, very attractive. It's this campaign, the whole media campaign to raise awareness, and this massive campaign of posters, films, public events, those just presented and even celebrated, I mean, if I can use this word, all this process, and putting Armenians and Armenian orphans, as you mentioned, as to symbolize the entire humanitarian mission, to humanitarian crisis, and also humanitarian mission to help to rescue these people. And it's very, very attractive. Do we have some research on this? I mean, visual materials.
Sure, I've done work on it. Jennifer Durr's done work on it. Yeah, there's work on it, also on photography and other things. I think some of the most interesting work done on Aurora Sunrise was just done in at least Semerjian's recent work, Remnants. So it's that part of Near East Relief is very evocative. And again, but you're right. It's easy to raise money for helpless children.
Yeah.
But that's a strategic problem that also comes with significant ethical problems. The first of which is what we call donor fatigue. Like once you've seen 2 or 3 starving Armenians, sure, you're moved. But when you see 8, 9, 10, you begin to think, oh, it's pretty normal for Armenians to be starving. Why do I need to give money?
Yeah.
And then the other is that development assistance, like the promotion and the rehabilitation of Armenian communities, that's not very glamorous at all, right? There's nothing glamorous there. That's about building structures, hiring people to sweep floors, having teachers come to work day in and day out, kids sitting there doing their lessons. There's nothing glamorous about it, but the impact is tremendous.
Yeah.
And so when Near East Relief put a lot of its eggs in this kind of starving Armenian waif basket, when the needs of the organization shifted with time, revenue collapsed. And it had to adapt to a different model. I mean, this is why recently the United States dismantled its most important foreign assistance arm, the United States Agency for International Development.
Yes, and also this creation of this image of starving Armenians was so familiar in the United States that maybe that's why United States Congress, if I'm not mistaken, they provided food to Republic of Armenia already, because they already knew that these people, these Armenian people, needed this.
I think there is a social memory of that, and certainly in 1989, I remember my grandmother telling me about raising money for Armenians.
I can share an story. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it fits very well. I was in conference during my stay at Rutgers, New Jersey, and there was an old man who told me that in his childhood, when he refused to eat something, his mother said, "Remember starving Armenians."
That's right. That's right.
So, and this image was
And
so
certainly-
established in society.
And since 1989, the United States has given something like $1.3 billion in assistance, in humanitarian assistance, to the Republic, which is a lot for a country the size of Armenia, right? It's dwarfed by the assistance that we give to Israel, for example, which is about roughly the same size. And but now that's ended, and which is really unfortunate, because I think that some of that commitment to support Armenia, especially in the early period after the earthquake, really had resonance with the earlier efforts. I think what's important now, and this probably won't air before I give a talk at the AGMI on this week, is that I wanted to reflect briefly on the real cost of the abandonment of the sort of American humanitarian support to Armenia, which is that a lot of this humanitarian support to here was, of course, what you might think in terms of health and food support and others, but a lot of it was going to Armenian civil society.
Yeah.
Right. And it's there's no substitute in this world. There's no independent philanthropic substitute for the kinds of foreign assistance that governments can provide. They just can't. Right. The Gates Foundation, it can give enormous amounts of money, but it's dwarfed by what the United States had given every year since the establishment of AID, and then its precursor organizations that in fact trace their origins to Near East relief. And so that contemporary vision of assistance to Armenia, which really was predicated on the idea that Armenia is a democracy, that it shares those values with the United States, and the Americans were like, we can help Armenian civil society. We're not getting involved in Armenian politics, but we can help Armenian civil society, especially women's organizations or support for religious minorities and others, education. That with the absence of that, I'm really concerned about the viability of elements of the kinds of organizations and groups in Armenia that I see are so important to the broader social and political conversation in this country. And the democracy doesn't come from the top down; it comes from the bottom up. And so civil society in Armenia is something that I've always valued and seen as being relatively strong. You may not agree, but I see it as a relatively strong feature, and certainly distinctive of Armenia's neighbors, right? It's a tough neighborhood to be in civil society, but Armenia is much better than the alternatives across our other borders. So that commitment, I would argue, is just what you said, which is this legacy of an American. Maybe they don't understand it completely, but we've helped Armenians in the past.
Yes,
right.
And this help was tremendous.
We
helped
them.
Fantastic. Yeah,
kind of like it's an American thing.
Yes, and it's
to help Armenians.
And it's kind of source of for pride, for pride to be proud of what your ancestors did. And the same thing, if you remember, I'm sure you know and you remember that each year, April 24th statement of United States presidents, they always mention this humanitarian involvement, for this help, this rescue.
That's right.
And yes, and unfortunately, I think in Armenia this help is kind of underestimated. It's not. I think at least we could have maybe a street named after the Near East relief or something visible, just to show that we remember this help, we remember this.
I think there's a story to be told about how during the Soviet era that memory was probably officially erased.
Yeah, yes,
right?
Yes, you're right.
So I because there's none of that in the Arab Middle East. There's still recollection of it. Places like the American University in Beirut, where important Near East relief officials went on to be faculty members. There's a memory of it, and in Aleppo and in Beirut, it's certainly the case. I know in the United States, there was a tremendous, some of the organizations recently really celebrated Kerr, and his son was Malcolm Kerr, who was a prominent American political scientist who was murdered by Hezbollah in the 1980s in Lebanon, and his son is the coach of the Golden State Warriors. He's a great basketball player, so we know about them. And I think that probably in the early Soviet period, acknowledging this critical American humanitarian assistance was very uncomfortable to them, and so that you couldn't integrate that into Armenian history in the 30s, let alone in the 50s and 60s. That just wasn't going to happen. Oh the Americans were great. They came here and helped rebuild Armenia. No, that wasn't going to happen. And I know that Near East Foundation has always been very interested in building relationships with the Republic. About a decade ago, they made a film about the Near East Relief's work, which it's called Lest They Perish.
Yes, if I'm mistaken.
And it's available on Amazon, but I don't know if it was ever translated into High Armenian, which I think would have been a really good idea at the time.
We should check. Maybe we have this Armenian version.
I mean, this is a shameless self-plug, but I think that maybe we should explore translating my book into Armenian, or at least one or two of the chapters. I think might be really useful, because even though I don't tell the story of what happened here, it really unfolds the efforts of Near East Relief.
Yes, and we are just speaking about these humanitarian efforts and kind of investment of resources and some stuff, but we should remember that there were real people working in this place, American citizens, who many of them just gave their lives for what they did, and tens and even hundreds, maybe, people who were involved in this process, who dedicated their life to this cause, and I think they're worth to be remembered.
Right. And there's good memoirs that were written of the time, again, that really should be translated into Armenian, and it's always remarkable. I mean, you read the memoirs of Armenian young people who had encountered Near East Relief through the orphanage system. They write very, sometimes critically, but also very sort of approvingly of the role that these Americans had, right? And you also, I mean, I'm an American. I think that one of the things that Americans are pretty good at is just being very friendly and open, which is a very different attitude. They're very self-confident. That can be very annoying to people around the world. But on the other hand, it means that they have the kind of confidence that they can go and help. So this is really, I think it's a valuable lesson to remember, that there's this different American engagement with the world, right? Which was about education, cooperation, health, agricultural development, right? That wasn't, it wasn't about imperialism. It wasn't about colonialism. It was because they believed in what they thought were important causes. They saw the Armenian people as people who needed and deserved help, and they were willing to do it. And all of them had different reasons. I think one of the most interesting memoirs about this period is by an American doctor named Mabel Elliott. And her memoir is called Beginning Again at Ararat, right? It's actually a really wonderful story. She works for Near East Relief first in Istanbul, where she writes about her encounter with upper middle class Armenian women who had been taken into Turkish households and raped and impregnated. She then works in Aleppo and in Adana and Marash, and she develops very close professional relationships with other Armenian professionals. But one of the reasons why she came to Armenia was because as an American woman doctor, she had a glass ceiling very early in her career. But humanitarian work, she could come here and she could run a hospital, right? So she could really live up to the full measure of her capacity. On the other hand, Near East Relief would probably block an Armenian from running one of their hospitals at the same time. So there is a contradiction there. And then eventually she comes here to Yerevan, where she helps, and she's one of the last major Near East Relief officials here before the Soviets finally closed Near East Relief down.
And then they just transferred these orphanages to Soviet Union? Or
I believe that's right. But also, by the time Near East Relief left, most of the young people were 16, 17, 18 years old. And so that there wasn't really a reason for them. And so they were often, I don't know if this was the case for your grandparents, but often they married other orphans, right? So why not, right? They married other orphans. Young men were sometimes put into the military, right? And that, that used to happen in Armenia, of course, as well. And others were then part of these settlement schemes in the new neighborhoods and so on around Yerevan and Gyumri. So they at that point the role for Near East Relief began to fade, and them as a political liability to the Soviets, like we just can't have these.
Yes,
Americans
in
here.
30s, they were not, the relations were not hostile, but at the same time they were kind of.
It's always remarkable. This is
so friendly.
This is totally missed in much modern scholarship on the Soviet Union and the United States, which was, I think that Near East Relief was about the only American institution functioning at all. In what became the Soviet Union. Right. So
it's very interesting story. Very interesting story. We have to explore. Of course, you have done tremendous job. Your book is fantastic. But I think each time we can find new documents. We can just look at this from another angle, from another perspective, and it's living topic to research and be engaged in.
So one of the things that just sort of, as I reflect back on it, that I wish there'd be more work on, right, is that I think that we have more writing by young people who encountered Near East Relief. I know we do, than like I worked on. I know that our colleagues at the AGMI are finding this more and more. I also think I want us to learn more about the American women relief workers that were engaged in this work.
Just personal stories.
Their personal stories, but also sort of what, this was a time when there were proportionally a lot of professional women were engaged in work with Near East Relief. Whereas if we could sort of were to look at equivalent institutions in the United States at the time, that wouldn't have been the case. The number of women in really critical leadership roles, working in roles that were often reserved for men, I think that would be important. And then also, I think we need to spend more time on this broader critique of what it meant to be sort of American humanitarianism without colonialism. What that meant more broadly. And then finally, this other idea that you've brought up, which is like really trying to trace the legacy of Near East Relief within contemporary Armenia. I mean, the reason why we haven't done that work is because we don't really have a lot of the archival materials that we have to do this work in Beirut or at the Rockefeller Archives for the Eastern Mediterranean. Not a lot of that is present especially for the Soviet era.
No.
It's just much of this is lost.
Thank you for the conversation. And one final question.
Sure.
It's traditional one, or rather two related questions. Why in this era of triumph for the natural sciences or technologies should one engage with the social sciences? or humanities? This is the first question, and the second one also related. And why did you personally choose to do so?
Well, I'll take the second one first. So I grew up in an interesting American household where I don't know how much time you have for this, but I'll make it quick.
No. We have time. Just use their time.
My grandfather was sent to Iraq in the 1950s as a U.S. humanitarian aid worker.
Oh, interesting.
And he was working for Point 4, which was a U.S. development organization that eventually became USAID. And in those days, development had to always be justified by Cold War politics, right? It's like, oh, we're sending all this American technology and knowledge abroad to prevent X country from falling to the communists. And so they sent him to Iraq in the 50s, and my dad went with him. He was just a high school kid, right? And my grandmother went, the same grandmother she'd gone to Berkeley, and she collected pennies for Armenians. She was very, very fervent Protestant Christian, right? And they lived in Baghdad, and their the man who managed their household was an Armenian refugee. And it connected the dots for my grandmother and my grandfather about this American knowledge of the Armenian genocide with an actual Armenian. And they lived in Idaho. There weren't a lot of Armenians in Idaho in those days, right? And so that man and his family really helped my family, my ancestors, understand what had happened to them, right? Why are these Armenians in Baghdad, not in Anatolia, right? And so they also had Assyrian friends, and the irony, of course, is that the house that they lived in had been lived in by Jews before the Jews had been expelled from Iraq. So a very complicated, very complicated story that was even more complicated is, they interacted with Kurds in northern Iraq who were facing, in those days, not as much discrimination as they would face later. So this is very unique for an American. And so I grew up with these stories, and of course, I went to college, the university, thinking that I knew all about, what had happened to the Armenians, and then encountering a professor who denied the Armenian genocide. It was terrible, actually. It was actually really awful. And then at UCLA, I met and married an Armenian woman, and people were always saying, "Oh yeah, you learned about the Armenians," or from her. Helena Wattenpaw is a very famous Armenian art historian. I said, "No. She wouldn't even have talked to me if I didn't already know about the Armenians." So I found it a very compelling story, but one that also interacted a little bit with my past. But I became very interested in this idea of how do people rebuild their lives after terrible atrocity? How do you do that? Right? It's not easy. It's not natural. And something we talked about earlier, which is Armenians just sort of disappeared, like other peoples who had faced genocide in the past, just sort of disappeared, right? That's the whole point of genocide.
Absolutely.
But they didn't. They didn't disappear. So it's an interesting story. So why should we study the social sciences and humanities? So I'll tell you something. I consider myself a humanist, not a social scientist, right? As historians, our job is to make the past understandable to people in the present, right? That's our job, and it's a job that our ancestors have done since the beginning of time, right? I mean, we're in the land of people who wrote on kachkars and stelas about great battles of the past, and the land of Gilgamesh and Enkidu and all this, right? The past helps us make sense of our present. It also makes us take pride in our present. It provides us a sense of belonging, a sense of connection with those who have gone before us, so that we don't feel so alone in our present. And so there's great beauty. And sometimes I think about how science can teach you how to build a bomb. It's the humanities that help you understand why you shouldn't use it.
Fantastic. Very, very good explanation, and thank you, Kit, again.
You're welcome.
You're welcome for this conversation, and for everything, for your research you are engaged in, and for your teaching, and for the chance to communicate with you.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. It's been so wonderful getting to know you and other. I know we don't feel this way. Younger scholars, and just I'm so. I said this before. I'm just so amazed with the strength of the emerging scholarship in Armenia now, and it's so different from what it was 20 years ago when I first started interacting with Armenian colleagues. And I'm just, to me, it's Armenians claiming their right to tell the story of their past, which is it's just wonderful to me, and the right. And demanding that the rest of the world listen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.